My girlfriend said, "You should be thankful I haven't left you yet." I looked at her and replied, "You're right." Then I left first, canceled everything we shared, and made sure she felt exactly what she thought I was afraid of. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Thanks. You should be thankful I haven't left you yet. She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing quietly for a long time. Not shouting, not crying, not even particularly heated. Just level, flat, like she was reading a number off a receipt. And she looked right at me when she said it. The kind of direct, unhurried eye contact that tells you the person on the other end has already thought through every response you might give and decided none of them matter. I was sitting across from her at the kitchen table. There were the remains of a dinner in front of us that I had cooked, from scratch, not from a box, because she'd had a long week. On a Tuesday, the week had barely started, but I'd cooked anyway, because that's what I did. I absorbed, I adjusted, I found a way, and she looked at me from across that table, across that dinner I had made, in that apartment whose lease was exclusively under my name, and told me I should be grateful she was still there. I looked at her, not with the panic she was used to seeing, not with the tight-chested scrambling that had become my standard response to anything resembling a threat. I looked at her with something I hadn't felt in months. Something still, something quiet, something that had finally run out of places to hide. And I said, "You're right." She blinked, just once, a small, involuntary thing. And in that single blink, something moved in the room between us, some invisible weight shifting from one side of a scale to the other, that she wouldn't fully understand for another 72 hours. 28 years old, together for 3 years and 4 months. Renting a 2-bedroom apartment in the kind of mid-sized city where everybody knows the same restaurants, the same shortcuts, and the same handful of people, which means everybody eventually knows your business whether they were invited to or not. I had a stable job in logistics management. She worked in marketing at a firm downtown. Her name was Claire. We had a shared lease, a shared streaming account, a shared gym membership, and a joint savings plan we'd started 14 months earlier, originally her idea, which she had been inconsistently contributing to for about 11 of those 14 months. From the outside, we looked like a functioning couple. From the inside, I had been quietly suffocating for the better part of 8 months. And I had said nothing, not a word, because I kept telling myself it would improve, because I kept telling myself she was stressed, because I kept telling myself the version of her I fell for. The one who laughed easily, who asked about my day like she actually wanted the answer, who would fall asleep mid-conversation on late Sunday nights and seemed genuinely at peace about it. That version was still in there somewhere, just buried under something temporary. I held on to that story for 8 months. Then she sat across from me at a kitchen table and said 5 words that made the story impossible to keep telling. I want to tell you who Claire was when we met, because that matters. She was sharp, genuinely quick in the way that made conversations feel electric, the way where you'd say something, and she'd already seen 5 angles you hadn't considered and picked the best one to respond with. She was funny, not performing funny, actually funny, the kind that comes from observation rather than effort. She cared about things. Music she loved deeply. Certain films she'd watched enough times to quote specific shots, not just lines. Causes she volunteered for on weekends early in our relationship, before the volunteering quietly stopped and was replaced by brunch and scrolling. She was the kind of person you fall for because she seemed so fully formed, so sure of herself, so interesting to be near. And for a long time she was all of those things with me too. She asked questions. She listened. She made space for me in her life in the deliberate, clear way that tells you someone is actually choosing you. That's what makes the gradual shift so disorienting. Because it doesn't feel like she became a different person. It feels like the same person slowly learned that she didn't have to work as hard to keep you. And stopped, inch by inch, season by season, until one day you look across a table and realize the person across from you stopped seeing you a long time ago, and you've spent months trying not to notice. The comment that night was not the first of its kind. It was just the first one that landed differently. Usually, when she said something like that, I'd feel a tightening in the center of my chest. A small, hot panic. A need to immediately reassure her that I understood, that I was trying, that I valued what we had, that I was sorry for whatever nameless thing she was implying I had done or failed to do. She had a way of making accusations without making them, of standing in the implication without ever quite committing to the actual words. I don't know why I put up with this. You're lucky I'm as patient as I am. Any other girl would have walked already. She'd said versions of those things before. Not constantly, not every single week. But in those particular moments of friction, when something wasn't going her way, when I'd asked for something and she didn't feel like giving it, when she was annoyed about something unrelated to me and needed somewhere convenient to put it, those lines would appear. And every single time, I would respond the same way. With reassurance, with apology, with the careful, exhausting work of resetting the emotional temperature of a room I hadn't heated up in the first place. She'd press the button. I'd scramble. Dynamic, reset. Until the night at the kitchen table, when I looked at her and felt nothing scramble. Just that stillness. That clear, quiet, terrible clarity. And I said, "You're right," and meant something completely different than she thought I did. Let me take you back to where it actually started to turn. Not the big moment. The quiet, unremarkable beginning of the slow slide. Because that's how it always goes. It doesn't start with a fight. It doesn't start with a screaming match or a thrown plate or a single moment you can point to later and say, "There, that's when things broke." It starts with a question that stops getting asked. She used to ask about my day. Genuinely. Not as a formality to check off before moving on to whatever she wanted to talk about. She'd ask and lean forward and sometimes interrupt mid-sentence just to laugh at something I'd described, or to ask a follow-up that showed she'd actually been listening. That stopped somewhere around month 28. Month 29. Not dramatically, not overnight, just gradually. The way a season changes and you only notice it after the fact. 1 month she was asking. The next she was half listening, phone face up on the table between us. The month after that, she'd already started scrolling before I finished the first sentence. I adjusted, told myself she was tired, gave her more space, shortened my stories, made them easier to have here, eventually stopped telling them altogether. Started answering, "How was your day?" with "Fine, same old," so we could both skip past the part where she wasn't listening and I was pretending not to notice. I don't know exactly when I stopped expecting her to be interested in me. I just know that at some point I had, and neither of us said a word about when that happened or what it meant. Then came the comparisons. This phase started about 6 months before the kitchen table night. Her coworker's boyfriend had just booked them a trip to Lisbon. Her college friend's partner had surprised her with a long weekend in Sedona. Her cousin's husband had renovated their kitchen from top to bottom because she'd casually mentioned wanting more counter space, just once, in passing, and he'd apparently started calling contractors the next day. Claire would mention these things at dinner, or in the car on the way somewhere, or on Sunday mornings when I was half awake and hadn't had coffee yet, and was in absolutely no condition to absorb comparison data. She never said directly, "Why don't you do that?" She was too smart for that, or at least too careful. But the implication was always fully dressed and standing in the room with us, making itself comfortable, helping itself to a drink. I tried. About 6 months before the kitchen table, I planned a trip. 4 days at a rented cabin a few hours north. I handled everything myself. Found the place. Read all the reviews. Packed the food we'd need for 4 days. Drove the entire way while she slept in the passenger seat. Got the fire going when we arrived. She complained on day 1 that the Wi-Fi was too slow to post properly. She complained on day 2 that the mattress wasn't as good as ours at home. On day 3 she mentioned, flatly, that we should have gone somewhere more interesting. On the drive back, I was quiet for about 2 hours. She fell asleep again. I drove in silence and thought about what it meant that I had planned something with genuine care, executed the whole thing myself, and still come out of it feeling like I hadn't done enough. I didn't say any of that out loud. I filed it in the place inside where I had been storing all the other things I hadn't said. That collection was getting heavier every week. Here is something nobody tells you about being the absorbing partner in a relationship. You stop thinking of yourself as someone with needs. It happens slowly enough that you don't notice it as a loss. You just notice, one day, that you've stopped mentioning things. That you've stopped suggesting plans because you already know which ones she'll dismiss. That you've stopped talking about your own ambitions because the reception is always tepid and you've learned to spare yourself the particular deflation of sharing something you care about and watching someone scroll through it. You stop in all the small ways first, and then in the bigger ones. And then one day you're sitting at a dinner you cooked, in an apartment you're paying the lease on, and the person across from you tells you that you should be grateful she's still there. And something in you goes very, very still. Not because the words hurt, but because they don't. And the absence of hurt is the clearest signal you've received in months. The first truly clear warning sign, the one I should have listened to, came about 5 months before the kitchen table. We'd had a disagreement about something small. I can barely recall the specifics now. Something about a bill, whose turn it was to handle which one, something like that. It had escalated the way minor things sometimes do when there is a larger, unresolved tension sitting underneath everything like a slow leak. And in the middle of it, she looked at me and said, "I don't know why I put up with this." Not screaming, not crying, just flat and certain, the way you say something you've thought but haven't bothered to say before because it seemed obvious. And I remember exactly what I did next. I remember it the way you remember something you're not proud of. I apologized. Not because I had done something genuinely wrong. Not because there was an actual transgression to apologize for. But because the implication that she might not put up with it, that she might leave, was enough to completely short-circuit everything else in me. Logic. Self-respect. The basic recognition that I hadn't actually done anything wrong. All of it bypassed in about 4 seconds flat. I apologized, and she accepted it with the calm, easy manner of someone who had been expecting it to arrive. And in the days after, I told myself it was just a rough patch. Told myself we were fine. Reset. Moved on. Or thought I had. My closest friend Owen had been watching all of this longer than I had, and seeing it more clearly. Owen and I go back to when we were 19. College. Same dorm floor, different majors, immediate understanding. The kind of friendship where you can go 3 weeks without talking and pick up exactly where you left off without any ceremony required. He is the kind of person who will tell you the truth even when he can see you are not ready to receive it, but who also knows the difference between telling you and making you feel it. He'd met Claire plenty of times. Dinners. A New Year's Eve 2 years back. A camping trip the summer before last where she had made it quietly clear all weekend, in small consistent ways, that she would have preferred a hotel and that my enjoyment of the outdoors was a personality flaw she was generously tolerating. Owen never said he didn't like her. Not once. He was too careful and too fond of me to do something that simplistic. But he said things. Small, precise things that he knew I'd understand when I was ready. "You seem different lately. And once. You used to have all these things you were working toward. The logistics idea. The climbing trip. What happened to all of that?" And then after that camping trip dinner, where she had talked over me 3 times in front of him and barely acknowledged doing it. "Hey, are you good?" Just that. Simple. Pointed. "Are you good?" And I had said, yeah, of course, totally fine. Because I believed it. Or because I needed to. Or because the difference between those two things had become genuinely unclear to me somewhere along the way. The night of the kitchen table, after she went to bed, I lay in the dark and didn't sleep. Not because I was churning. Not because I was upset in the way I used to be when we fought. But because something had settled in me that I needed to sit with before I moved. I lay there and thought about what I actually wanted. Not what I was afraid of losing. Not how to manage the next conversation or repair the next thing. What I actually, genuinely, wanted my life to look like. And for the first time in months, the answer came through without negotiating with fear first. I texted Owen. 2 sentences. "Something clicked tonight. I think I'm done." His reply came in 4 seconds flat. "I know. What do you need?" No lecture. No recap of everything he'd seen coming. No version of "I told you this." Just immediate, quiet readiness. That is the kind of friend a person should be lucky enough to have even once in a lifetime. I told him what I was thinking. He said, "Do it clean. Don't over-explain. Just move." Good advice. Best I'd gotten in months. The next morning, I was completely, deliberately unremarkable. Got up at my usual time. Made coffee. Ate breakfast. Sent some work emails. When Claire came into the kitchen around 9, I asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. I made it. She watched me over the rim of her mug. I could feel her watching in the particular way you feel attention that is searching for something. The familiar pattern wasn't showing up where she expected it. There was no approach. No soft opening. No version of, "Hey, can we talk about last night?" She tried once, that evening. "You've been quiet today." I looked up from what I was reading. "Just thinking," I said, and went back to the page. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Left the room. And I could hear it, the recalibration beginning. The slow, uncertain realization that the button she'd pressed wasn't producing its usual sound. On my lunch break 2 days later, I called our apartment management office. The lease was up in 60 days. My name was listed as the primary tenant, a fact I'd been clear on since we signed, though I don't think she'd ever thought hard about what that meant practically. I confirmed what the lease clause said about sublease transitions. I asked about the process for transitioning the primary tenant name. Got full answers. Thanked the woman on the phone. Hung up. Then I called Owen. Told him I was starting to move. He said he had a spare key cut. I told him it might take a few weeks to do it properly. He said, "The key's yours. Time doesn't matter." The streaming account cancellation happened next. I removed Claire's profile from my family account one evening while she was reading in the other room. 2 days later, she tried to pull something up on the TV and got a profile not found error. She called out from the living room. "Hey, something's wrong with the account." I came to the doorway. "Oh yeah," I said easily. "I was cleaning it up. You can set up your own, probably same price." And I went back to what I was doing. She stared at the TV, then at her phone, then quietly opened a browser, signed up for her own subscription, and didn't say another word about it. But the energy in the room had shifted. A degree or two. Nothing dramatic. Just the air changing. Then the gym. We had a couple's membership under my name, her added as a dependent. I removed her as a dependent. She got an email notification from the gym that evening. She came into the kitchen with her phone, screen facing me. "Did you change our gym membership?" "I updated mine," I said. "You can set up your own account. It'll be about the same rate. Independent memberships are cheaper now anyway." She looked at me for a long moment. Not angry yet. Searching. Like she was pressing her hand against a wall where there used to be a window, feeling only solid surface. "What's going on with you?" she said. "I'm making some adjustments," I said. "What does that mean?" "It means what it means." My voice stayed completely level. No aggression. No coldness performed for effect. Just honest. Just mine. She stood there another moment. Then she left the kitchen, and I heard her in the other room. Not on a call, not watching anything, just sitting, thinking. For the first time in a long time, I felt like she was actually sitting with something real. The joint savings account was the next step. We had a standing automatic transfer, one from each of us, into a shared account we'd set up 14 months earlier. One evening while she was on a long call with her sister, I sat at my desk, logged into my bank, and canceled my automatic transfer. I moved my accumulated contributions back into my personal account. Her portion, everything she'd deposited, stayed completely intact. I wasn't taking what wasn't mine. I was taking back what was. The bank sent a confirmation. I looked at it for a moment, closed my laptop, and felt, for the first time in a while, like my own person. Around the same time, I had a conversation with a coworker named Ben. Ben worked in my department. Steady, easy guy. We'd had lunch a few times. Nothing deep. He'd recently bought a 2-bedroom condo and was tired of covering the second room's cost himself. I mentioned casually that I might be looking at a change in living situation in the coming weeks. He said the room was mine if I wanted it. Fair price. Clean space. Easy arrangement. I told him I confirmed by Friday. I confirmed Thursday morning. The weekend before I told her, I moved small things. Just the personal accumulation of 3 years. Books I cared about. A box of things from before the relationship. Documents. Chargers. A jacket that had somehow migrated to the back of her closet and I hadn't seen in 2 months. I moved things in a duffel bag, a few trips at a time. Owen helped. We didn't make it heavy. He put music on in the car. We talked about easy things on the drives. And on one of those drives, somewhere between one trip and the next, he glanced over at me and said, "You seem like yourself again." I had to take a breath before I answered that, because I hadn't realized until he said it just how long it had been since someone said that, or since it was true. I told her on a Sunday evening. Chose Sunday deliberately because she had work Monday, which meant the night had a natural shape and limit. I didn't want an open-ended confrontation, just a conversation, a real one. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. Same 2 chairs, same table. She was on her phone. She looked up. Something in the particular quality of my stillness must have read as different. She put the phone face down, which she never did. "I'm moving out," I said. Clean. No preamble. No warm-up sentence. "What?" she said. "My name's on the lease," I said. "I'm not renewing. Management already knows. You have 60 days to decide your next step. And I've already spoken to them about transitioning the lease to your name if you want to stay, which is a straightforward option. I'm covering the shared bills through this month. After that, they're yours." She stared at me. Her expression moved through things in quick succession. Disbelief. A flash of something real and startled. Then, because this was Claire, a rearrangement into something more like challenge. "Are you serious right now?" "Yes." Because of what I said. That one night. That one comment. "It wasn't one comment," I said. "And I think you know that. So your plan was to just secretly undo everything, without a single word to me." "Not secretly," I said. "Privately. I made a decision about my own life. I don't owe anyone a committee vote on that. She pushed back slightly from the table. This is insane, she said. You're throwing away 3 years because your feelings got hurt and you decided to punish me for it. Something in me didn't rise to meet that. Didn't tighten. Didn't need to defend itself. I just let it land and pass. My feelings have been hurting for a while, I said. I just stopped pretending they weren't. She asked if there was someone else. I told her no. Complete truth. She asked if I'd been building an exit strategy for months behind her back. I told her no. The specific plan came after the kitchen table. Everything before that was just a person quietly hoping something would shift while learning, slowly, that it wasn't going to. She sat with that for a moment. If something was this wrong, she said, why didn't you just tell me? Why didn't you say something? I did, I said. Earlier on. Smaller things. And every time, the conversation would end and nothing would change. So eventually, I learned what those conversations were worth. And I stopped having them. She opened her mouth. Closed it. This was the part she couldn't redirect because she knew it was true. Not true in the way of an accusation demanding she accept it. True in the plain, boring, undeniable way that true things are true. I could have done better, she said finally. Yeah, I said. I could have too. So then why does it have to be over? If we can both see where we went wrong, why can't we fix it? I looked at her carefully before answering. Because seeing where something went wrong isn't the same as being able to fix it, I said. And more than that, what went wrong between us isn't one solvable issue. It's the way you see this relationship. What you think you bring versus what I bring. What you think I owe you for staying. Those things are fundamentally different from how I see it. Getting past that wouldn't just take a conversation. It would take both of us completely relearning how to do this. And I don't have that in me anymore. The room went quiet. The longest quiet of the conversation. Then she said, you really thought about this. For 8 months, I said, without knowing I was. She cried then. Real crying. The kind that doesn't come out composed. The kind with no particular audience in mind. And I want to be honest about how that felt. It wasn't easy to sit with. Not because it made me want to change course, but because I still cared about her as a person. 3 years of real life doesn't evaporate. There were good things between us. Good memories. Good seasons. Seasons where things worked and felt easy and felt like what I'd been hoping for. She hadn't been awful every day. That's not how relationships like this go. It's not constant misery. It's enough goodness to keep you in a slow, grinding imbalance underneath everything that you adjust to until the adjusting costs you more than you have. Caring about someone and being right for someone are not the same equation. Confusing them is how people stay in the wrong situation for a decade. When the crying quieted, I said, I genuinely think you're going to be okay. How are you this calm? She asked. Because I wasn't calm for 8 months on the inside, I said. This is just the outside finally catching up. She looked at me for a long time. Like she was trying to find the version of me she knew how to handle. Not finding him. Meeting someone else instead. There was a moment later that night. After the conversation had wound down, after the crying had settled, after we'd both exhausted the words available to us, where she stood in the hallway outside the guest room. She didn't knock. She just stood there. I could see the shadow of her feet under the door. She stood there for about a minute. Maybe 2. Then the shadow moved. And I heard her walk to the bedroom. And close the door. And I lay in the dark and thought about what that minute meant. She had been standing at the door trying to decide whether to try again. Whether there was a version of this where she came in and said the right thing and it all reset one final time. She'd stood there long enough to feel the full weight of not knowing. And then she'd walked away. And I think that was the moment she understood, on some real level, that the button didn't work anymore. That the door she'd been holding open as leverage for months had swung back around. And was mine now. I slept in the guest room that night. The apartment felt different. Not empty in a sad way. More like a room after a window has been opened for the first time in a long time. Different air. Different quality of quiet. I lay there thinking about 3 years. Not with regret. Not with grief. With the particular, clear-eyed understanding that comes when you stop rewriting something and just look at what it actually was. I thought about the cabin trip. About all the adjustments I'd made. About all the versions of myself I had quietly folded up and put away because they didn't fit neatly into the space she needed me to occupy. About the startup idea that had been sitting in a drawer in my head for 2 years because Claire had made it clear, without ever quite saying it directly, that she found it unrealistic. About the plans and the climbing trips and the things Owen had noticed were missing from me before I noticed them myself. I didn't feel righteous about any of it. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a person who had been wearing someone else's coat for 2 years and had just taken it off. Lighter. Surprised by the lightness. A little cold at first, but lighter. Monday morning she left for work without saying anything to me. I heard the front door close. Got up. Made coffee. Worked from home. The apartment felt like mine again. Not hers and mine in the way where her preferences were the default and mine were the accommodation. Just mine. And that was a feeling I'd forgotten I was allowed to have. Owen came over that evening with food from the Thai place we'd loved since college. We sat at the kitchen table, that same table, and ate and talked about nothing important for an hour. A game he'd caught the end of, a situation at his job I'd been following like a podcast. City construction blocking his street. Normal, easy things. And then at some point he set his chopsticks down and asked, "How are you actually doing?" Honestly, yeah. I feel like I've been holding my breath for 8 months, I said. And I just exhaled. He nodded slowly. Good, he said. Is it strange that I already feel relief? No, he said. It means you knew. You knew before that night. You just waited until you were sure enough. I thought about that long after he left. About the quiet, private way we carry certainty around with us long before we're willing to call it by its name. Here is what Claire expected to happen. I know this because of everything that came after. She expected the morning after approach. She expected me to appear in the kitchen with coffee, probably before she'd fully woken up, with that particular soft, apologetic energy that signals someone wants to smooth things over. She expected the familiar shape of the reset. She expected me to say something like, "I've been thinking about last night," in a tone that made clear I was taking responsibility for a crime I hadn't committed. She expected me to reattach. She had every reason to expect it. The pattern had worked reliably for months. Press the button. Scramble. Reset. What she did not expect, what she had no framework for, was silence. Not angry silence. Not punishing silence. Just the ordinary, unbothered quiet of a person who had made up his mind and was done negotiating with the outcome. She texted Tuesday afternoon while I was at my desk. "Can we talk tonight? I've been thinking." I replied, "Sure. I'll be home around 7. She was there when I got in. She'd clearly prepared. I could tell because when she glanced at her phone at the start of the conversation, I caught a glimpse of her notes app, full of what looked like bullet points. That was not like Claire. Claire talked first and thought later. Seeing written notes told me the last 48 hours had reached her in a way our previous conversations hadn't. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about feeling like you were disappearing in the relationship." "Okay," I said. "I didn't know you felt that way." "I know," I said. "But I also think some of that is on you," she said. "Because I can't fix something I don't know is broken." "That's fair," I said. "And I've already said I own that part. So if we both see where it went wrong, why can't we work on it? Why does it have to be finished?" I sat with that before answering. "Because seeing where something went wrong isn't the same as having the resources to fix it," I said. "And more than that, the thing that went wrong is more fundamental than one addressable issue. It's the assumptions underneath everything. The belief you had that I was more afraid of losing you than you were of losing me. That belief shaped how you talked to me, what you thought you could say, what you thought I'd absorb. And it was right for a long time. But it's not right anymore. And I don't think either of us can unbelieve something that was true that long." She was quiet. "You think I took you for granted," she said. "I think you got comfortable," I said. "I think the dynamic worked for you, so you stopped examining it. I don't think it was deliberate. But you're still leaving." "Yes." She looked at her hands. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "You don't have to do anything with it," I said. "You just have to figure out what comes next for you. And you will. You're capable of that." She brought up the line herself. About a week later, in a text, "I've been thinking about what I said that night. About you being thankful I hadn't left. I don't think I actually believed it when I said it. I think I was feeling disconnected and didn't know how to say that. So it came out the wrong way." I read it twice, then wrote back, "I believe you. That doesn't change where we are. But I do believe you." She replied a while later, "Did that one thing really start all of this?" And I wrote, "No, that one thing just made everything visible. It's not the same." She went quiet for a while. Then, "I think I understand that." And then, "I hope you know I did love you." And I wrote, "I know. I loved you too." Past tense. Both of us. Said and acknowledged and real. It's a strange, specific kind of relief, naming the past tense. Letting a thing be what it already became, not what you wish it had stayed. I moved my remaining things out on a Thursday. Owen helped. We took 2 cars. Didn't need many trips. 3 years of shared life. when you extract only what is genuinely yours, takes up less space than you think. The room at Ben's place was clean and simple. One window, morning light, smaller than what I'd had, and I stood in the middle of it after Owen left, looking at the four walls, and I felt something I genuinely hadn't expected. Not sadness, not victory, not relief exactly, though that was part of it. Possibility. The particular, slightly breathless feeling of space, of being uncompressed, of not having to hold a shape that someone else chose for me. I sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the window, watched the light change across the wall, and I was fine. Not repaired yet, not finished with everything the 3 years had left inside me, but fine. Genuinely, deeply, quietly fine. The first week in the new place, I cooked dinner for myself 3 nights in a row. Simple things, nothing elaborate, but I noticed something about it. I noticed that I plated it however I wanted. I ate when I was hungry and not when a schedule dictated. I watched what I wanted to watch. I stayed up late reading the kind of long, dense book I'd stopped finishing because the living room had always been occupied by something she wanted on. I went to bed when I was tired. I woke up when I was ready. And all of these things, small, ordinary, utterly unremarkable things, felt like breathing freely for the first time after a long time of breathing carefully. Ben knocked on my door Thursday evening. Said he was ordering pizza if I wanted in. I said yeah. We sat at his small kitchen table and talked about nothing important for an hour. And I realized that an hour of talking about nothing important with someone who asked for nothing from me was the most relaxed I'd felt in a very long time. I have thought a lot, in the weeks since, about that line. You should be thankful I haven't left you yet. And here is what I've come to understand about it. She was right. For a long time, she was completely right. Not because I owed her gratitude for staying, but because I had built, brick by brick, over 3 years, a version of love where her continued presence was the thing I was most afraid to lose. I had organized everything around protecting that one thing. My comfort, my honest voice, my clear sense of what I deserved, my plans and ambitions, and the startup idea I'd quietly buried because Claire had made it clear she found it unrealistic, never quite saying so, but making it felt in every small way available to her. All of it arranged in service of the singular goal of keeping her from leaving. And what that meant in practice was that I had handed her a quiet, enormous power. The power to define our terms, to reset our dynamic, to deploy a particular kind of sentence and watch me scramble back to her, that she probably didn't even fully recognize she held. She used it, not always consciously, not always deliberately, but she used it because it was there, because I had put it there. And the moment I took it back was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday, at a kitchen table, over a dinner I had cooked, when she said those words expecting a familiar result, and instead got a stillness she had no response prepared for. It's been about 6 weeks now. Claire took over the apartment lease. The management office sent me a transfer confirmation. I don't know much else about her situation. We haven't spoken in about 2 weeks. The last texts were polite, functional, the kind of messages that happen when 2 people are genuinely untangling logistics without any remaining emotional investment in making the other person feel anything. Ben is a good roommate. Quiet. Respectful. We watch games on Friday nights sometimes. Talk about easy things. It requires nothing. And there is something quietly extraordinary about a living situation that requires nothing from you at the end of a long day except to be present. Owen and I have been getting food more. Last week, a new barbecue place near his apartment. We ordered too much. Talked about something he'd been reading. A project I'd started thinking about again at work. The startup idea came up again, the one from the drawer in my head, and we talked about it like it was real. Because it is real. It was always real. I just needed to be in a room where I was allowed to think so. And sitting there across from Owen, eating too much barbecue and talking about something I wanted to build, I felt a specific, identifiable thing. Ownership. The feeling of owning my own future again. Of it being mine to imagine and mine to pursue and mine to fail at or succeed at without first calculating whether it would fit inside someone else's vision of who I was supposed to be. I had forgotten what that felt like. More precisely, I had forgotten that I was allowed to feel it. I sat there in that barbecue place, full and easy and genuinely light, and I thought about all the Sunday mornings I had spent quietly managing someone else's mood before I'd even had my first cup of coffee. And stopping. And how that chapter was over now. And how it was over because I chose for it to be over, not because it imploded, not because it was taken from me, not because I was left. Because I left. First. Deliberately. Without apology. and how the end of something exhausting and the beginning of something better can be the exact same moment, if you are willing to let them be. Here is what I want to say about the way she found out she'd been wrong. Because underneath the canceled accounts and the moved boxes and the lease transfer, that is what this story is actually about. She thought my fear of losing her was the deepest, most load-bearing thing in me. She thought it was structural. She thought it was why I absorbed what I absorbed, apologized for what I apologized for, and stayed long past the point when I should have spoken. She was right that the fear was there. She was wrong about how permanent it was. Because fear, when it goes unaddressed long enough, doesn't deepen. It exhausts itself. It burns through its own fuel. And what is left on the other side of exhausted fear isn't nothing. It is the clearest, flattest, most honest version of yourself you have ever encountered. It is the version that knows exactly what it wants and what it's worth and what kind of life it is and isn't willing to live. And the moment I met that version of myself was the moment I looked at her across a kitchen table and said, "You're right," and felt something settle into place that I haven't felt shift since. She thought I would break. She thought the button still worked. She thought pressing it one more time would produce the same sound it had always produced. She was wrong. And I didn't tell her she was wrong. I showed her, not to punish her, but because some truths cannot be delivered in conversation. They can only be understood through experience. She needed to know that the assumption she had been operating on, that I was more afraid of losing her than she was of losing me, was no longer true. Not so she would suffer, but so she would stop. Stop assuming. Stop leaning on it. Stop moving through a relationship the way someone moves through a room where all the furniture has always been arranged for their convenience, and never expecting to stub a toe. I couldn't give her that understanding in a speech. Some things can only be learned by living them. So I stepped aside and let her live it. I want to say one more thing about the way I went about this. Because I know there are people reading who will wonder if canceling the accounts and moving quietly was petty, was calculating, was designed to be some kind of slow, methodical punishment. And I understand why it might look that way from the outside. But here is what it actually was. It was clarity. It was the natural result of a person who had been tangled up in someone else's preferences and needs and comfort for so long that even the simple act of handling his own affairs felt like a radical statement. I didn't cancel the streaming account to hurt her. I canceled it because it was mine and I was separating what was mine from what was ours, and that was a real thing I needed to do. I didn't move the savings contribution to punish her. I moved it because it was my money going toward a future that no longer existed. None of it was performance. It was just a person doing the practical work of disentangling a life. The fact that each step landed on her like a slow realization, the fact that she felt, piece by piece, what she had assumed I was afraid of, that wasn't the goal. That was just the truth revealing itself. And the truth doesn't need engineering. It just needs room. About 3 weeks after I moved out, she called. Late evening. I picked up. She said, "I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that's asking for something back. Just, I'm sorry for the way things were." I said, "I hear you." She said, "I know it doesn't change anything." I said, "No." She said, "Okay." We stayed on the line for a moment. Then she said, "Take care of yourself." And I said, "You too." And that was it. Clean. Complete. No bitterness to perform. No warmth to fake. Just two people who had run their course, saying so in the only way that had any honesty left in it. I keep coming back to that kitchen table. That exact moment. Her face. The words hanging in the air between us. "You should be thankful I haven't left you yet." And me sitting there, looking at her, feeling something finally settle into place after 8 months of shifting, and saying, quietly, without drama, without performance, "You're right." She thought she was landing something. She thought she was pressing the button. She thought she was reminding me of my position. What she was actually doing, without knowing it, was handing me the moment. The exact moment I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. The moment where I stopped reaching for her and started reaching for myself. And I took it. I took it, and I walked right out the door she'd been holding open as a threat. And I did not look back. Not because I stopped caring, but because I had finally, completely, started caring about the right person. If this story felt familiar somewhere, if you recognized the patterns, the accumulated silences, the way a person can slowly stop existing inside a relationship while technically still showing up every day, I hope you also heard the part that comes after. Not the canceled subscriptions, not the moved boxes. The part where a person sits in a room of their own and feels, for the first time in a long time, like there is enough air. It does not always require a grand gesture to get there. It doesn't always require a speech or a fight or a dramatic final confrontation. Sometimes it just takes one sentence landing differently than it ever has before. One moment of quiet, absolute clarity at a kitchen table on an ordinary night. That's all it takes. And then you know, and you move, and you stop asking permission to take up space in your own life. And you find out, slowly, quietly, in the ordinary, unremarkable moments of a life that finally belongs to you, that the thing you were most afraid of losing was never the person. It was yourself. The self you had been folding and compressing and adjusting for 2 years just to fit inside someone else's idea of what you should be. That self was right there the whole time, patient, waiting for you to come back to it. And the moment you do, you realize it never left. It just got quiet. And now it isn't quiet anymore. 3 months passed. Not dramatically. Not in the way of movie montages where someone reinvents themselves over a season and emerges unrecognizable. Just quietly. The way time moves when you stop spending most of your energy managing someone else's emotional weather and start actually living inside your own days. I worked. I cooked real dinners in Ben's kitchen on the nights he was home and simple ones on the nights he wasn't. I started running again. Something I had stopped doing about 18 months into the relationship. Not because anyone had told me to stop, but because the mornings had gradually gotten filled with her schedule, her needs, her rhythms, and mine had slowly gotten pushed out of the frame. The first morning I ran, I made it about 12 minutes before I had to stop. 12 minutes. For something I used to do for an hour. That told me everything I needed to know about what the last 2 years had quietly cost me in ways I hadn't been measuring. I kept running. Every other morning. Then every morning. 12 minutes became 20. 20 became 40. By the end of the second month, I was back to something close to what I used to be, and the particular feeling of pushing your body forward through cold morning air and finding out it can do it. That feeling alone was worth more than I could explain to anyone who hadn't been coasting on someone else's comfort for the better part of a year. The startup idea came out of the drawer properly around the 8-week mark. I don't mean I quit my job or launched something overnight. I mean I started writing things down. Actually writing. Not just holding the idea loosely in my head the way you hold something you're not sure you're allowed to want. I bought a notebook, a real one, not a phone app, and I started mapping it. The problem I wanted to solve. The market gap I'd been watching for 2 years from inside my logistics job, seeing the inefficiency every day and knowing, in the specific way that people who work inside broken systems know, exactly where the break was and what would fix it. I filled the first notebook in 3 weeks. Owen looked at it one Friday evening over dinner at his place and said, "This is the thing, isn't it?" Not a question, a statement. "Yeah," I said. "You're going to do it." "I think so." "Good," he said, and went back to eating like that was that. Owen has always understood that some announcements don't need to be celebrated loudly. Some things just need to be witnessed. I ran into Claire's friend Petra at a coffee shop in early November. Petra and I had always been pleasant with each other, not close, but genuinely warm in the way of people who like the same person and are polite about sharing that overlap. She saw me first, waved. I went over. We did the brief, slightly loaded small talk that happens when 2 people share a mutual friend who is no longer in one person's life. She asked how I was. I told her honestly. Good, actually really good. She smiled. Not the sympathy smile, the recognizing smile. "I'm glad," she said. And then, after a pause, "She's doing okay too, just so you know, in case you were wondering." I told her I was glad to hear that. And I meant it. Not as a performance. Not as the kind of polite thing you say because social convention requires it. I genuinely meant it. Because whatever had happened between us, Claire was not someone I wanted to be suffering. I wanted her to be okay. I just also needed to be okay. And for a long time, both of those things hadn't been able to coexist. Petra left with her coffee. I sat back down with mine, looked out the window at the street, and felt, quite simply, fine. Here's something I've noticed about the months since. The absence of certain kinds of tension is invisible until it's gone, and then its absence is so loud you can't believe you ever thought the tension was just background noise. I used to come home, to that apartment, to that life, and feel something tighten in my chest before I even opened the door. A bracing, a subtle, unconscious preparation for what mood I was walking into, for whether it was going to be a good evening or a loaded one, for whether I'd have to manage something or whether I could just be. I hadn't registered that as a problem. I thought that was just what coming home felt like. I know now that it isn't. I know because I come home now to Ben's apartment and there is nothing to brace for. The door opens. The place is just a place, quiet or occupied, depending on whether Ben's watching something, but either way, just a place. No reading of atmospheres. No calibrating. No performance of being okay when I'm not, or hiding how I feel about something so the evening doesn't turn. Just coming home. I had forgotten what that felt like. I didn't know I'd forgotten. In December, I called my older brother, Caleb. Caleb lives 3 states away. We talk maybe 6 times a year, but he's one of the people in my life whose opinion I trust most, not because he's always right, but because he has the rare quality of being honest without needing you to react a particular way to the honesty. He said when I told him, "I wondered when you'd say something." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means I saw you at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and you looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with travel," he said. 2 years ago. He'd been watching for 2 years. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "Because you weren't ready," he said, "and because you had to see it yourself." I thought about Owen saying almost the same thing a different way. I thought about how many people who cared about me had been waiting, patiently, for me to arrive at something they'd already seen coming. There is something both humbling and affirming about that. Humbling because you realize you weren't as hidden as you thought. Affirming because you realize you were surrounded by people who were willing to wait. It's now been almost 5 months since the kitchen table night. For months since I moved out. The apartment is Claire's now, fully and legally. The startup plan is 40 pages of notes and one working prototype that barely functions but exists. I'm still running every morning. I'm still terrible at it on days when it's cold. I do it anyway. Something happened last week that I want to tell you about. Not because it's dramatic. Because it isn't. Because the undramatic nature of it is exactly the point. I was at a work event. The kind of after-work function that logistics companies throw in December to feel like they have culture. And I ended up in a conversation with someone from a different department, a woman named Alice, who I'd seen in the building before but never talked to properly. We ended up talking for about an hour and a half. About work, then about not work, then about things that are hard to explain how you got to from work small talk, but you ended up there anyway. She was funny, sharp in the specific way I'd once found electric. She asked about something I'd mentioned in passing, the startup idea, which I'd only referenced briefly, and instead of moving on, she leaned in. "Wait, tell me more about that," she said. And I did. And she listened. The whole time. And asked follow-up questions that showed she'd been tracking what I said instead of waiting for her turn. And something happened in me during that conversation. Not fireworks. Not the dramatic cinematic version of a shift. Something quieter. Something like recognition. Not of her specifically, but of what it felt like to be actually listened to. To have someone lean in when you talked about something you cared about instead of glancing at a phone. To be in a conversation where you didn't have to make yourself smaller to fit. I hadn't been in that kind of conversation in a long time. And the fact that it felt remarkable told me more than anything else about how long it had been since it was normal. We exchanged numbers at the end of the night. I don't know what that becomes, if anything. I'm in no rush to find out. But I'll tell you this. The morning after, getting ready to run, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. And I looked like myself. Not tired. Not performing okay. Not carrying something I hadn't agreed to carry. Just myself. The same face I've had my whole life. Looking back at me the way it used to before I handed the version of myself that was easy and uncomplicated into someone else's keeping and started living in whatever shape was left after she was done with the good parts. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. And I thought, there you are. There you actually are. I want to close this with something that took me a while to understand. Not a lesson. Not a moral. Just a thing that became clear slowly, the way things do when you give them room. I used to think the bravest thing I could do in that relationship was stay. I used to think that love was primarily demonstrated through endurance, through absorbing, through showing up, even when showing up cost you more than you had to give. I thought leaving was what people did when they weren't brave enough to stay and work through it. I was wrong about that. Not about staying in general. There are relationships worth enormous effort. There are hard seasons that are worth enduring because what's on the other side of them is real and mutual and worth fighting for. But this wasn't that. This was a season that had been going on for 8 months with no other season in sight. And the brave thing, the actually hard thing, turned out not to be staying. It was leaving. Leaving when everything in you has been conditioned to associate leaving with failure. Leaving when the relationship has trained you to believe that your fear of losing it is proof of how much it's worth. Leaving when the person across from you tells you, in 5 flat words, that you should be grateful she hasn't gone yet. And instead of scrambling, you just look at her and say, "You're right." and mean it in a way she will spend months understanding. That was the brave thing. Not loud, not heroic, not satisfying in the way of movie endings. Just a person finally choosing himself. Quietly, completely, for the first time in a very long time. If there's anything I want you to take from this, and I'm not in the business of telling anyone what to do, it's this. Pay attention to how you feel when you come home. Pay attention to whether you are bracing or arriving. Pay attention to whether the person you're with makes you more yourself or less, and whether the gap between those two things has been slowly growing for longer than you've been willing to name. Pay attention to the things you've stopped saying, the plans you've stopped mentioning, the parts of yourself you've quietly retired because they didn't fit the shape of what your relationship needed you to be. Those things don't disappear. They wait. They are patient in a way that feels like peace until you realize it was just silence. And when you finally come back to them, when you finally open that drawer and take out the thing you put away and hold it in both hands again, you will feel something that is hard to describe to anyone who hasn't felt it. Like waking up, like a window opening, like your own name, said out loud, in your own voice, after a very long time of answering to something else. That's the thing on the other side of all of this. It doesn't have a bow on it. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It's just a Tuesday morning with a run ahead of you and a notebook full of ideas and a room that's yours. And it is, quietly, undeniably, without apology, enough.